this will be an individual reflection point to start, guys. So I'm just going to time, I've got my phone here and I'm just going to time 30 seconds. And I'd love for you guys to come up with a definition of skill and what you think skill is in the most concise term possible. And then as well, see if you can talk about some of the characteristics that you think determine a skilled football player. So I'm going to put maybe about 40 seconds on right now. And then I'd love it if you guys could just pop your answers in the chat. Really looking at kind of conceptualizing what skill is, and shifting away from the premise that skill is solely some type of technique that is embedded or acquired and kind of held within a football player and then brought out at the right time. So what we're going to really spend a lot of time focusing on is the importance of the environment. And for me, I just talk about how skill, it's the relationship between the player and their environment. So, this would be a very kind of traditional activity, dribbling through cones, and, not just something we see in football, we see it in every sport. And the problem with that is the player, the performer in this instance, they're pulled out of their natural environment, and the environment that they're encountering, it's an artificial one. They're not having to attend to the same things that will drive and shape those movement solutions within the match itself. So things like opponents, teammates, time pressure, fatigue, score, all these different constraints, in a drill such as this, they're just not present. So the analogy I use, and you guys have probably seen a lot of freestyle performers. For you guys in the UK, I saw one at Brighton Pier a couple of weeks ago when I was visiting my family. And, you take a performer like this and they look really impressive. They look really skilled, right? But then typically you'd put them in a game situation and some of the very impressive techniques and tricks that they're doing make not even useful. They can't even do it. And there was a really good video that came out a couple of weeks ago on Twitter. It was a defender for a Spanish team. I can't remember who it was, but he was playing and defending against some different freestyle players who were attacking, dribbling at him from, the same angle. And not one of them was successful. And the reason why is because the techniques that they spent so much time rehearsing and learning, they've been trained out of context. And anything that's trained out of context, it effectively has to be relearned in context. So I'm just going to play this video, and I'm going to take my AirPods out just before I put them back in so you can hear the audio. And I'm just going to let this play for about 30 seconds or so.
Against Sweden, Cruyff produced the move that defined his talents. It took a couple of seconds to lose the defender, but we've been talking about the Cruyff turn ever since.
I never did on a training or in free times tricks. I never did tricks. I saw something and I did it, and it just came out. There was an opponent there, and you had to outplay him. So that was the easiest way. So you just do it.
Okay, so I think that's a really, really interesting video, obviously from a legend of the game. And I remember when I was younger, in the 3-4 years I played football, techniques such as the Cruyff turn would practice very
against
frequently. But as Cruyff just alluded to in that clip, the movement, the solution that emerged was to solve a problem that he encountered at this specific moment in time. So in other words, he was very attuned to the opportunities, aka the space that he had in this moment, the location of his defender, where his other teammates were. So he was attuned to all these variables and he moved accordingly, and the Cruyff turn was born. Now, traditionally, what we've seen in the football world, in the basketball world, in all sports is, as coaches, and this is what I used to do too, I would see these techniques that players did, techniques that emerged in the game, and then I would try and break them down and teach them. But the problem with that approach is neglecting the fact that every situation is so different. The environment is always changing. And a lot of the times these solutions emerge because there are good movements for each player, and every player is so different. So the Cruyff turn is obviously something that's really effective, really functional for Cruyff, but could be the complete opposite for another player. So there's no one size fits all approach. And this kind of manifests into the dominant approach that we see in coaching, where there's a big technical focus in terms of what is the correct technique. And as coaches, we have these idealized techniques of things that we believe must be performed in a certain way. We see a lot of moves being taught. Things like the Cruyff turn would be taught as a specific move, hoping that players can then apply it later. The coach's role is seen as, it's seen as a central part of the practice, where players learn as a result of us as coaches transferring all the knowledge we have directly onto them and imparting the knowledge we have of the game onto them. And it's not just kind of manifested in this technical focus, but it also leads to how the game of football is played itself. So very fixed patterns of play, things like game models, which tend to be quite rigid, where as opposed to players necessarily learning actually how to play, they're learning a model of the game. And we're going to look at principles of play as an alternative to that later on. Transactional coaching I want to speak about. And of course, something which we see mostly with this approach is drills and corrections based on one idealized model. So coaches, if you have a notebook with you or a piece of paper, I would love for you just to write your name 6 times as identically as you can on the exact same part of your paper. So I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to do that right now. What did you guys notice as you did that? Feel free to unmute and just say, or you can just type it in the chat box. What did you notice as you did that task?
John says everyone is slightly different.
Yep.
Brain tried to slow you down to keep in line with the name. Okay. Become more stifled. None were exactly the same comes up again.
Great. So that's exactly it, guys. So it's impossible to do that task. I set you up for failure because every time you do it, your name is going to be slightly different. Now, I'm actually sitting outside right now enjoying a nice evening here in Italy, but most of you, I'm guessing, are probably inside. So you didn't have things like wind moving your paper about. You had the same pen that you probably used across those 6 repetitions. You didn't have a defender or a teammate that you were having to attune to. And yet, despite all of that being a very closed environment, your name was still very different. So what this obviously leads us to is understanding that variability and embracing variability, it's an essential part of player development. And within that dominant approach that I showed you a few moments ago, variability is seen as something that's typically undesirable, as noise that we don't want. And that's exactly what I used to do when I started coaching. I wanted players to perform highly similarized technical movements, models of the game, such as patterns of how to actually play football in basketball, in my context. And I wanted them to repeat the same offenses over and over. But the problem is that's just not what happens in the game, because the nature of football itself as a very complex sport, as a team sport, means that variability is all around us. And so we have to embed variability into the training process. Now, I'm sure you guys would have all seen Messi's free kick the other day in his debut for Miami. Now, I thought that was a really interesting example, because a free kick is an example of quite a closed situation within the game of football in terms of set pieces such as throw-ins, free kicks, corner pieces. That's obviously a little bit less complex than the open environment when the ball is live and in play, but still it's a very variable situation. It's very complex because no free kick is ever the same. The conditions are different. In this instance, the pressure, it was, in injury time, it was going to be, one of the last maybe possessions of the game. So, that was their only chance to win. That free kick would be very different to if Miami were maybe 2-0 up in the 20th minute of the game. So no free kicks ever the same. Where the players are, the position on the floor, all of these variables. And yet this, for me, was an amazing example of skillful performance. What I want to look at now is actually understanding the free kick that we saw and, the beautiful movement solution that emerged and all of that, what accounts for how skills actually emerge within the game of football. So to do that, we're going to use Newell's constraints model. So this is a huge part of getting onto the constraint-led approach, which I'm going to mention later on. This by itself, though, is not the CLA, not the constraint-led approach, but it's very important that we understand constraints, which is why we're starting with this. So I've put some examples here of individual constraints. So according to Newell's model, there are 3 types of constraint category. And these constraints, guys, are always present in every match and in every training session. So even in a training session that follows a dominant approach and uses drills and things like this, well, the constraints are still going to be present in those scenarios. So you can read there some examples of individual constraints, especially interesting to think about how these could maybe an attacker is in possession of the ball, they're dribbling down the right wing. You know, how could their individual constraints compare to those of the left back or the fullback? And how could those shape different skills emerging? So for instance, playing against a really speedy and quick player is going to be different to playing against a much slower and heavier player. Playing against a smaller versus a taller player, maybe when the ball is whipped into the box, the heading solution that may emerge is going to be very different. So individual constraints are very important. And how we can respect these in terms of how they lead to different skills emerging is simply ensuring that in the training environment, we're constantly playing with and against different people. So as opposed to maybe playing against the same defenders the whole time, the matchups change a little bit. Maybe they're playing with some different teammates, and very different solutions will emerge if we keep those things mixing as opposed to just keeping players in the same groups. Then we've got environmental constraints. I think, you know, these are probably some of these things related to things like the surface temperature of the surface, the playing conditions, the weather. I think those are way more important in football versus my sport, basketball, which is played indoors. So, you know, training at different times of the day, when there's rain, maybe still going out to practice, because the movement solutions, the skills that emerge will be very different versus playing on a dry football pitch. Then we've got constraints which are very important, not just things related to the actual, you know, playing environment, but the wider social, cultural, historical constraints. So for instance, a player growing up in Brazil is going to move in a very different way to a player growing up in England, to a player growing up in Australia. So I'm going to highlight some of these things later on, and that's going to be a specific part of this session that we have together. And the last type of constraint is the task constraints. These ones, coaches, are the ones that are most important in your training environments, because these are the ones which you can manipulate the most easily, the most readily. Okay, it's a lot easier to manipulate this category of constraint. So of course, we've got the rules of football itself, the offside rule, out of bounds, the time and score, the nature of the game. Then, of course, we've got teammates and defenders, their location, what they're doing, how they're interacting, different formations, different principles of play. Maybe there's a scout report. So those would all be related to the game itself. But then, of course, if we're using small-sided games in practice, you know, task constraints, a very small-sided game could change significantly. So the number of players that we have in it, how we start the small-sided game. Maybe we're doing a small-sided game with 3 goals as opposed to 2. Maybe we're changing where the goals are positioned. Maybe we're changing the space that we have to play in. So these are all examples that we're going to look at a lot tonight in terms of how we can manipulate these constraints to lead to different skilled solutions emerging. And this is a great quote from Ian Renshaw, and he's a name worth noting down. He's one of the leading kind of figures within the ecological world. And he talks about, well, if performance within the game of football requires adaptability in terms of those 3 categories of constraint are always present and they're always changing. So if that's the case and that's how skill performance emerges, why would we not want to practice in environments that also contain those features? So everything I'm sharing with you guys today, it's not my opinion, but it's based on evidence-based ideas. So a lot of these come from studies and actual research based on an ecological dynamics rationale that looks at how we actually understand human movement.